So hello, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar of this four-part series on pandemics and plagues in the ancient world. My name is Tyler Franconi. I'm a visiting assistant professor of archaeology at the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology in the Ancient World at Brown University in the United States. I've organized this series to run parallel to a course that I'm teaching here this semester on pandemics and plagues in the Greek and Roman worlds. And I want to extend a particular welcome to my students in attendance today, many of whom I'm sure have already come ready with questions for the discussion later. It's truly wonderful to see such a big group here from literally all over the globe, and especially the many friends and colleagues that have been separated by our own current pandemic. And while Zoom is certainly no replacement for meeting face-to-face, it's at least something in these otherwise isolated times. Now, I'll introduce our speaker, Professor Kyle Harper, in just a moment, but I do need to say a few words about the format today. So after my introductory remarks and Kyle's presentation, which will be about 45 or 50 minutes, we'll have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. Now, unfortunately, due to the scale of this event, we're not going to be able to turn on video or audio for attendees. And so therefore, we're going to encourage you to use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions both during and after the talk. We'll go through these and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. I will ask them on your behalf to our speaker during the Q&A session. All right, finally, this presentation is going to be recorded and it will be posted online afterwards for your continued viewing pleasure. And this will be available on the Brown University YouTube channel, and we'll be sure to put those links on the original information page with the registration and so on that you've already visited. All right, so that'll be ready sometime after the talk ends. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Kyle Harper. Kyle's professor of classics and letters and provost emeritus at the University of Oklahoma. His work has spanned a broad spectrum of economic, environmental, and social history, both in the Roman world and well beyond. In addition to a large number of articles in leading journals such as the Journal of Roman Archaeology or the Journal of Economic History, he's the author of 3 books to date, including 2011's Slavery in the Late Roman World, 275 to 425, 2013's From Shame to Sin, The Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality, as well as his most recent book, 2017's The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. This most recent book, many of you are probably aware of and has probably brought you here today. It's recently been described as a reviewer as the, quote, thunderous entry of nature into the world of ancient history of the 21st century. And he's currently writing his 4th book, A Global History of Infectious Disease, that will take readers well beyond the Roman world, and we can all look forward to its publication in the near future. Kyle, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you. I'll see you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler and team, for setting this up and for inviting me, and to all the attendees for being part of this conversation. Now the moment of truth, see if I can manage to successfully share my screen. It looks like I have done so. So someone find some means of interrupting me if I'm wrongly assuming that you're looking at my screen. Great. And I'll also just say that I hope we don't experience technical difficulties, but we're in the midst of a storm in Oklahoma and power is out all around me, although it's only flickered off here once or twice. So let's keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. If we do have a really drastic interruption, Tyler has my PowerPoint. I'm going to call in over the audio, but let's hope that's not necessary. And instead, let's talk about the history of pandemics. When you're a Roman historian, you develop a lot of practice at all times of handling gently people's opinions about the parallels between the past and the present. And when you work on pandemics in the Roman world, you can expect to field a lot of questions in the midst of a pandemic about whether or not we are Rome. And I will say that in some ways, this is obviously very exciting because the history of infectious disease can and should be relevant and help us understand the world that we live in, and particularly in the midst of a health crisis. But it's also very humbling. And I think one of the lessons that certainly I've learned is how far we are from having a really true comparative history of the history of pandemic disease. And so I won't be focusing on what we can learn or lessons to be drawn from the Roman experience. And the differences between the ancient world and our own are obviously enormous. We have far greater science that helps us understand the nature of infectious disease. We have strong states that can protect public health, at least in theory. And in some ways, we've escaped from infectious diseases. And that's one of the real hallmarks of the modern world, is that infectious diseases are brought under control and what's called the epidemiological transition. People die of non-infectious causes like cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and so on. But in some ways, this paradoxically actually makes our societies more fragile, or at least more prone to interruption in the face of an infectious disease like COVID-19, which will have mortality tolls that are far lower than the kinds of pandemics that were experienced in the past. And yet, in some ways, it's our expectation that we have escaped from these kinds of events that makes us more vulnerable to the disruption that we're experiencing now. Today, all I want to do is try and talk about one particular and I think important episode in the long history of human confrontation with infectious disease. And I think that's helpful to put particular episodes like the Antonine Plague into a bigger context. And I want to focus on what we know and don't know about the biology of this important episode. Today, going to give a quick overview of the contours of the event that we call the Antonine Plague, and then moving quickly into discussion of the biology of the Antonine Plague, and then a little bit about the impact of the Antonine Plague and how we can frame the impact of a disease event like this in the past as historians. So some of you will be very familiar with this event, but if not, let's start with maybe an empathetic reading of what some of the ancient sources have for us. It was a pestilence so great that it could not be cured by any medicine. It was, according to the Dr. Galen, the greatest and longest lasting pestilence. Would that it would ever end. It was a pestilence that, like some foul beast, foully destroyed not a few people, but even rampaged over whole cities and destroyed them. It was, in the words of an oracle of the god Apollo, an event in which you are not alone in being injured by the destructive miseries of a deadly plague, but many are the cities and peoples which are grieved at the wrathful displeasure of the gods. In the words, supposed words of Marcus Aurelius on his deathbed, why weep for me rather than the plague and those whom it killed? In the words of the later 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, the germ of that pestilence burst forth, which after generating the virulence of incurable diseases polluted everything with contagion and death from the frontiers of Persia all the way to Rhine and Gaul. So what are they talking about? The Antonine Plague. It's one of history's truly significant pandemic events. And an endemic disease is a disease that is typically present in a population. An epidemic disease is an outbreak of disease, generally at a local scale. And a pandemic is an interregional epidemic. That is, it's an outbreak of an infectious disease, generally with elevated levels of mortality, and an interregional event. And the Antonine Plague is a pandemic event in the sense that it's clearly an interregional disease outbreak caused by an infectious agent that happens under the Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius and his son and successor Commodus. And it's known as the Antonine Plague, since it's the family name of the ruling dynasty. It's not plague. So in English, the word plague can be used either in a generic sense of pestilence, or it can be used in a specific sense to refer to disease events caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that we call the plague. And the Antonine Plague is a plague in the more generic sense. It probably would be better to call it the Antonine pestilence. And there's very little reason to believe that it was caused by the bubonic plague, although not strictly impossible. But that's never been compellingly argued, and certainly I don't believe it. It's first attested in 165 in the Roman Empire. I believe that there's at least some reason to believe that it was connected with an outbreak of infectious disease in Arabia, just outside the Roman Empire, that a few decades ago, Christian Robin called attention to in a series of Sabaic inscriptions that testify to a pestilence over the whole land in Arabia in the years just leading up to the Roman Empire. And it really is a series of disease outbreaks that transpire over the course of a generation. So there are multiple sort of aftershocks of the initial wave of infection that happens in 165, 166. In the Roman mind, the disease started when Roman troops under the command of Avidius Cassius deep inside Parthia in Seleucia on the Tigris impiously broke a truce and then sacked the city, and then went inside the temple of Apollo, released a vapor that then spread over the empire. Certainly the Romans perceived the pestilence as following in the footsteps of the troops who returned from the campaign, and I think we can at least believe that the army played some role maybe in disseminating the contagion, although this origins myth is part of a series of invectives against Lucius Verus and Avidius Cassius, who would go on to rebel against Marcus Aurelius. And in any case, the disease is inside the empire a year before that, as attested by Aelius Aristides, as well as an inscription to the god Apollo. Throughout the late 160s, it spreads across Italy and the Western provinces as well, and reverberates, as I said, for about a generation. We know of a very significant relapse of the disease in the year 189. In the bigger picture, this disease event is part of a real moment of transition in the history of the Roman Empire that's long been of interest, not just for people who do environmental or biological history, but really a moment of transformation in Roman history that's marked at the political level by the succession of the Antonine dynasty, by the Severan dynasty. So it's part of a broader series of transformations that are important in Roman history. Ever since Richard Duncan Jones in 1996 brought renewed attention to the Antonine plague by arguing vigorously for its importance, there've been a really ongoing series of conversations about the Antonine plague that involves a number of big questions, like what triggered it? Should we envision it as an event that's triggered by endogenous, say, Malthusian forces, or exogenous factors like climate? What caused it? What is the biological agent? The most common hypothesis is that it's caused by the smallpox virus. That is, in fact, really the only biological agent that's received very much consideration, but I think it's far from certain, and I'll talk about some of the reasons for that as well today. What was its demographic impact? And then more broadly, what was its economic and political impact? And here you see a wonderful photograph of a lead amulet that showed up in London that protects its wearer from plague, invokes the help of the god Apollo, the long-haired. Let me talk in the first section about the biology of the Antonine plague and broadly make three arguments. One, that we should imagine this as an emerging infectious disease event, that ultimately the cause of this is the evolutionary emergence of a novel pathogen that appears in the Roman population in the later 2nd century. And I'll maintain, although with some caution, that we have some good reasons to think that this was at least an ancestral form of smallpox, and possibly, in a sense, the debut of the smallpox virus in human populations, a disease that would go on to be one of the most important human diseases until its eradication, thanks to the development of first inoculation, and then in the late 18th century by Edward Jenner, vaccination, and then global health campaigns in the 19th and particularly 20th century that have made smallpox the only infectious disease of humans that has ever been completely intentionally eradicated by public health interventions. But before its eradication, it was one of the truly significant diseases of human history. And I think it's important to try and understand disease events like this in the very big picture. And to do so, one of the best guides remains William McNeill's 1976 book, Plagues and Peoples. And he argues that we should think of the Roman pandemics, a series of major epidemic diseases that strike the Roman Empire in its imperial and late imperial period, in terms of a bigger ecological history that helps us understand why disease events like this happen. And McNeill's, the architecture of his argument is that humans, societies, foster the emergence of a large number of highly virulent infectious diseases, starting with the Neolithic Revolution. So the invention of farming, the domestication of animals like cattle and pigs, brings human societies into close contact with new diseases that cross the species barrier and infect human societies. And McNeill sees this as a process that happens in the early Neolithic, and then in the later stages of the Neolithic, like the Iron Age, what happens is what he calls the confluence of the civilized disease pools of Eurasia. So with the rise of permanent trading systems across the Indian Ocean and the Silk Roads, that the once separate disease pools of Eurasia in the Mediterranean, in the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia flow together with explosive consequences. And so he sees the pandemics of the Roman period as the result of an earlier phase of disease emergence in the Neolithic, and then a later phase of contact between societies of, as he sees it, Eurasia. It's a great story. I think it now is one that needs a great deal of revision, as Tyler mentioned, and as I can give a shameless plug, this is what I'm working on, is trying to think about the big picture of how human ecological transformation has helped support the evolution and transmission of different infectious diseases. And I think McNeil's book, although it's an amazing work, it's 1976, and we know a lot more about the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. And I think today we'd be less willing to put all the emphasis on, say, domesticated animals, whether cattle or sheep or pigs or camels, as the ultimate source of our diseases, and instead see them really as a bridge between the much broader world of wild animals, and to recognize that the human diseases originate largely with wild animals, sometimes jumping across species barriers, including our livestock, but originating with diseases with animals like rodents and bats. That in some level is unsurprising, since 60% of all mammals are either rodents or bats, and they are the ultimate reservoir of many new human diseases, of course, including most recently SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. I think if we were rewriting McNeil's book today, we would realize that evolution is stronger, more continuous and constant. And in consequence, many of our most famous pathogens are actually younger than we might once have believed. And it would also change the picture in the way we understand the biological hosts of our diseases. And one of the things I'll talk about a little bit today is that one of the patterns of biological evolution that happens over the last several thousand years is that human numbers grow, as human societies grow, pathogens adapt to us. And one of the really distinctive ways in which they do so is by narrowing their host range and coming to focus on the infection of humans. So I think we can see the Antonine plague in these bigger terms. And as we do so, we have at our disposal traditional sources like Galen, like Ammianus Marcellinus, written sources that help us understand the nature, timing, even scale of biological events in the past. But these kinds of sources have really serious limits. And historians of medicine talk about the challenges of retrospective diagnosis. It's very, very hard to use a text like, use a writer like Galen as a way to understand what the actual causes of ancient disease events were. Galen didn't have germ theory. He didn't think of diseases in the same cultural or scientific terms that we do. He thought of the body in terms of the four humors. He thought of health in terms of balance. And to read Galen's text as a source of clinical knowledge about a disease is very, very difficult. And it's one of the reasons why we remain even today uncertain about the identity of the biological cause of the Antonine plague. We also, the further back we go into the past, lack mortality data. And it makes it harder and harder the further back we go into the past to know what the real scale of some of these biological events were. So there are serious challenges, but I also think we're lucky to live at a moment where we have increasingly new kinds of evidence, particularly from the natural sciences in the form of genomes. And genomics is a tremendously exciting source of new knowledge about the past of health and disease. And really, there are several different overlapping and complementary ways in which what we're learning from the genomes of the pathogens that cause disease helps us understand the history of human encounter with infectious disease. And one of the most important ways is what is called paleogenomics. Johannes Krause called it genomic time travel or genetic time travel, and involves the recovery of genetic material, biomolecules, usually DNA, from archaeological material. So you can see on the right, skeletons from a cemetery of the 6th century in Cambridgeshire, where Marcel Keller and team who's going to talk later in this seminar, are going to talk about the recovery of actual remains of the DNA of the bacterial agent, Yersinia pestis, that caused the Justinianic plague. And in some cases, this has been extraordinarily revolutionary for helping us understand what diseases were present in the past, and then answer other questions about how widespread, at least the geography, the geographic scope of different past disease events, as well as sometimes very specific molecular facts about the kinds of, the nature of biological agents of diseases in the past. So paleogenomics, the archaeological recovery of genetic material that helps us understand the past of disease. Complementary to that is the study of phylogenetics. So phylogeny is simply an evolutionary tree. Think of it as a family tree that tells us about the relationships, the evolutionary relationships between different species or different populations, different strains of organisms, whether viruses or mammals. Understanding the family tree of diseases can help historians understand the chronology, the time depth for the evolutionary emergence of diseases. It can sometimes help us understand the geography. For instance, it can help us answer questions about whether diseases originated in the old world or the new world. And it can help us understand the host background, what animals served as the host for the evolutionary ancestors of the pathogens that then became human diseases. So these are ways in which natural sciences can complement the traditional sources and can at least sometimes help us answer questions that we couldn't answer from traditional written sources alone. Let me give an example that I think provides a kind of a instance of the sorts of insights that we might be getting from the study of paleogenomics and phylogenetics. And this is a study that came out this summer. That's a study of another respiratory viral disease, measles, caused by a virus that only infects humans. It's a very important disease throughout history. It's, of course, still in circulation, although it's highly preventable with a very good vaccine. And here you see on top a representation of the phylogeny, or the evolutionary tree of the measles virus. Its closest relative is RPV, Rinderpest virus, which is a disease of cattle. And in turn, those two viruses are most closely related to a third disease that causes a similar viral disease in small ruminants, but it's the peste de petit ruminant virus. And this is a representation of the timeline of these evolutionary divergence events. And you can see that the divergence between measles and rinderpest has been redated with better samples and better evolutionary models to sometime in the first millennium BC, most likely sort of in the middle of the first millennium BC. You can see that's a timeline on the bottom of the top chart that shows the probability of when the measles virus diverged from the rinderpest virus. And then you see on the bottom a representation with the same time scale. The timeline applies on the bottom chart as well. And the dots are representation of the biggest known cities in 3 regions of the world. Measles virus, because it only survives in the human host, requires large populations. And those dots are representations of the largest cities. You can see the dotted line is the minimal population size that's required to sustain transmission of the measles virus. And it's pretty remarkable that just as soon as human societies develop cities that are large enough to sustain measles, it seems to have diverged from its ancestral form and become a fully human disease. So this is an example of the ways in which understanding the phylogenetics of human diseases can help give us at least some sense of the time depth of their evolution, the kinds of ancestors and relationships that they had with other pathogens, and then the relationship between human social change and the biology of infectious diseases. This kind of new knowledge is helping us color in what we know about how the Romans died. We have every reason to believe that the Romans lived in a high mortality society where life expectancy at birth was probably somewhere in the low to mid 20s, and crude death rates, which is how demographers measure the level of mortality in a society. It's a measure per 1,000. Crude death rates would have been somewhere in the 30s. And simply because Romans lived in a pre-modern, pre-transitional society where most people died most of the time of infectious diseases. The Romans would have been haunted by a range of respiratory diseases, both chronic respiratory diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy, which we know were both present in the Roman Empire, as well as acute respiratory diseases, a whole range of fecal oral diseases, which were possibly some of the greatest killers in the Roman Empire, including diarrheal diseases, particularly probably shigellosis and other forms of dysentery, as well as enteric fevers like typhoid that are spread generally through contaminated water. And then at least in large parts of the Roman Empire, vector-borne diseases like vivax and in Southern Europe and North Africa and Near East, falciparum malaria, as well as macroparasites like roundworm, whipworm, hookworm, which we know were a burden of disease in the Roman Empire. In societies where infectious diseases are the major cause of death, there is always interannual variation. That is that there are healthy years, there are unhealthy years due to changes in the climate, changes in the food supply, and then complex dynamics that have to do with immunity and susceptibility. So variation in the death rate would have been the norm in Roman society, year to year, healthier and unhealthier years, depending on these sorts of natural and social factors. One of the really interesting patterns that I think has become very robust in our understanding of Roman health is what we can call the Roman paradox, that despite in many ways robust economic expansion, urbanization, the Romans experienced a general deterioration in the level of biological well-being, largely due to the fact that Roman urbanization and connectivity was very conducive to the transmission of infectious diseases. And here you see a study that was published just about 2 years ago by Wim Youngman, based on his collaboration with Geertje Goldewijk-Klein. There is a definitive study of over 30,000 Roman femurs, since femurs are a very good proxy for achieved stature, and since stature is a general proxy for biological well-being. This is, I think, a more robust confirmation of what had already been shown in a number of more local studies, that for some reason in the late Republic and in the early Empire, people generally get shorter in the Roman Empire. There are different possible explanations for that, but one compelling one is simply that the Roman Empire fosters an environment where the transmission of infectious diseases is very rampant. We know that cities promoted the spread of infectious diseases, life expectancies were lower, and generally health was lower in ancient cities. So the Roman Empire was bad for people's health simply because it supported the transmission of those sort of endemic background infectious diseases. But against that background of sort of low-level variability in year-to-year mortality due to changes in the infectious disease environment, there stands out these events starting with the Antonine plague. And what we don't know about the Antonine plague is a lot, including what caused it. We don't have any paleogenomic evidence yet, although as I'll come back to, it's theoretically possible if it's smallpox that there will someday be paleogenetic confirmation from skeletal remains of the 2nd century that helps us nail down definitively what the biological cause of the Antonine plague is. But in a really fundamental way, we don't know what caused it. And we're mostly thrown back on retrospective diagnosis from Galen, trying to read through this very different cultural lens to identify what was the real biological cause of this large-scale disease outbreak. And because of Galen's description of the disease, most people who've hazarded a guess have argued for the identification of smallpox. Galen describes a black extrusive rash that covers the body, in which the sores are dry and rough, and then scab and scar. He describes a lengthy course of clinical illness with days 9 through 12 critical, which is quite an important clue because smallpox is a kind of slow-moving pustular rash. And then he describes what would have to be, if it's smallpox, a description of a hemorrhagic form of the disease characterized by the passage of bloody stool. You may know this, but in the 1970s, the Littmans argued strongly for the identification of smallpox. Sometimes this has been taken as more or less fact, if you look at the volume on the Antonine plague published by Elio Lacascio. But in more recent years, medical historians like Gorovich and Rebecca Fleming have at least argued that we should be cautious. And I think they make some very important points about how difficult it is to really identify with certainty from the kinds of sources we have. And they raise really interesting questions like, why don't the sources, including Galen, describe blindness, which is one of the really important sequela of infection by smallpox. And there's relatively little description of the permanent scarring that's such a characteristic remnant of smallpox infection. Moreover, several of the contemporary sources describe that the Antonine plague infected animals. Herodian, for instance, says there was great destruction both of livestock and men, whereas smallpox is very host specific and does not in modern times, in modern outbreaks of smallpox, cause widespread livestock disease. So these are real problems in identification of the biological agent. And that's just sticking with what we know about the 2nd century. If we zoom out, there's still a lot to be learned about the bigger history of smallpox. And I think for starters, we would love to know more about what the Chinese evidence says about the history of these kinds of highly virulent pustular diseases going back to the Han Dynasty. And I'd love to know more about what Hua Tuo and Tao Hongjing have to say about the history of these diseases. There's certainly hints of disease, but it's very hard if you're limited to the European languages. We're starting to see in the case of the Black Death, more scholarship that's brought into to those of us with those sorts of linguistic limitations in study of the Chinese sources, which are quite ample. And we can look forward, hopefully, to more scholarship on the history of disease in the 1st millennium. And until we have that, I think we're sort of looking at this with one eye closed. We're only seeing a very fractional part of the picture. So we don't know if smallpox was in China, but we need to. We can say that I will assert that there is evidence for smallpox-like disease in the 4th and particularly the late 5th century in Eusebius, and then above all in a Syriac chronicle of Pseudo Joshua the Stylite, who describes an outbreak in the 490s in Edessa that absolutely sounds like smallpox. He describes the lesions covering the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand, which is very diagnostic of smallpox, as well as scarring in the aftermath. So I think that there is evidence, written evidence, for virulent smallpox in late antiquity, but there's a real problem in that in the Central and late Middle Ages, there are also a number of important medical texts that describe smallpox as a relatively mild disease of childhood. And so the great Persian physician Rhazes, all the way down to the 16th century Italian physician Fracastoro, who's an important figure in the rise of sort of germ theory, and who very clearly describes endemic smallpox as a kind of mild disease that affects children. So these are real conundrums in the study of the bigger history of smallpox. And in some ways, we've known this for a long time. There's a classic paper in the history of medicine by N. Carmichael and Arthur Silverstein that shows that in the 16th and 17th century, smallpox becomes much more virulent. And there's evidence for this in the New World with outbreaks of smallpox in Mexico in the early 16th century, and then in Europe, particularly in most of Northern Europe in the 17th century. So the history of smallpox is pretty wild and pretty still poorly understood in the big picture. And the Antonine plague may or may not be a piece of the puzzle. I think that we're working with a puzzle without enough pieces until we get more ancient DNA evidence. And in recent years, we've started to get more pieces of this puzzle. In 2016, an important paper was published by Anna Dugan et al. That sequenced a 17th century mummy from Eastern Europe that provided a very important archaeological point on the evolutionary tree. And it does confirm that here you see the phylogeny, all of the modern diversity of smallpox that was sequenced in the 20th century is very, very modern. It's not very old. And the 17th century sample that they sequenced is basal, so it lies on a branch that's older. And this would seem to suggest that smallpox is a pretty young disease. And in some ways, when this paper came out, I think it may have sort of made it harder for those of us who think that there was early smallpox to explain it. But what it does tell us is that smallpox evolves in very recent centuries, and that the entirety of the modern diversity of smallpox risen only in the last few centuries. But part two, earlier this year, a team of researchers, Muleman et al., it's Eske-Villerslev's lab, that published a very important paper on smallpox, the variola virus, that sequenced at least 13 individuals who died of smallpox, 11 of them in the sort of Viking age, so say the last several millennia, several centuries of the first millennium, the 600s, 700s, 800s in Northern Europe. And they were able to retrieve these very old samples of variola virus that tell us several things. One, 100% confirmation that some form of human smallpox is more than 1,000 years old. All of these samples belonged to an otherwise unknown sister clade. So think of a kind of branch of the family that doesn't exist anymore, didn't exist in the 20th century, that somewhere along the way was either went extinct or was replaced by more modern forms of smallpox. They hypothesize that the ancestral smallpox, these human forms of smallpox that existed in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, may have had a wider host range. Some of the genes that get turned off in later forms of smallpox because they're unnecessary once the virus has fully adapted to the human host, were still probably turned on in this more ancestral form. And that's very interesting for students of the Antonine plague, where, as we saw, there's evidence that the plague may have affected animals. It's very possible that ancestral forms of smallpox that could cause disease in humans also infected a wider range of animals. And quite importantly, it tells us that the most recent common ancestor, so this inferred, this has not been found, but we can understand that there was a shared ancestor between early medieval smallpox and modern smallpox, and that they shared a common ancestor around 300 years ago, around 300 AD. So in late antiquity, in the time period of the High Roman Empire and the late Roman Empire, this is an important juncture in the evolutionary history of smallpox. So this is quite important and fascinating for students of the Antonine plague, and opens up, I think, the possibility that the period of the Roman Empire was very eventful in the history of these branches of the orthopox virus family. Here you can see the closest known relatives of the smallpox virus are camelpox virus and a virus that infects a rodent, the Pterapox virus, that only is known to infect the naked-soled gerbil, which is a rodent that's native to Central Africa. So these evolutionary relationships are going to be quite important as we continue to get different pieces of the puzzle. And of course, with more sampling of both human and animal diseases, we may get more and possibly unexpected pictures. But I think what this is showing us is that the period of the Roman Empire and late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is an important phase in the evolutionary history of smallpox virus. So I would hypothesize that the Antonine plague can be considered a biological event that's triggered by the evolution of ancestral smallpox, likely from a rodent orthopox virus that still possibly had a broader host range. Maybe in Africa, since certainly camels and naked-soled gerbils both exist in Africa, but it's also possible that those were imported there. We don't really know where smallpox evolved, but I think it could have easily been spread either through Silk Road or even more likely Indian Ocean and Red Sea trade. Remember that there's disease outbreaks in Arabia in the decade before the Antonine plague, and the extensive Persian Gulf trade would have been certainly a conduit for it to arrive in Seleucia in the 160s. We can also admit that there's still plenty we don't know about what this ancestral smallpox would have been like. Would it have been as virulent? Would it have caused exactly the same kinds of disease? Probably would have been roughly similar, but there's still certain zones of uncertainty. And we don't know as much as we would like yet about what that early evolutionary history looks like. And until we have archaeological DNA samples, it's likely that we may not. And again, I'll underscore that there's, I think, still a lot of exciting new information to be gleaned from a deeper study that's engaged with the biological evidence, as well as the European and Mediterranean evidence that brings South and particularly East Asia into a more global picture of the history of this pathogen. what did it do to the Roman Empire? And here I'd urge us to frame conceptually a difference between the primary or first order impacts of a disease event like this, and then higher order impacts, the economic and political ramifications. And in the case of a disease outbreak like the Antonine plague, it's a struggle even to know what the primary first order impacts were like. How many people did it kill? Much less to talk about higher order and more complex systems that involve the economy and the empire itself. And I want to spend most of my remaining time talking about what we know about the primary impacts, the demographic effects of the Antonine plague, and what we don't know. And then I'll just, with one slide, offer some closing thoughts about how we might think about the impact of the Antonine plague in Roman history more broadly, but do so in a very cursory way. I think we should, when we're doing this kind of history, encourage both quantification and comparison. As full of error as it is, in some ways helps us clarify the boundaries of what's possible and enables us to think about how the Antonine plague looks in comparison to other events in Roman history and other events in later history as well. And we should think, did the Antonine plague kill 2% of the population, 10% of the population, 25% of the population? To me, the boundaries don't go much higher than that. There are very, very few instances of infectious disease events that cause mortality on a scale larger than that. And almost all of those involve the singular bacterium Yersinia pestis. So I think there is some upper limit on the possible impacts that simply comes from a broader knowledge of the history of pandemics. And I think it's helpful to quantify, and sometimes it's clarifying. I'll quote one of the great skeptics of the impact of ancient disease events, Christer Brun, who's argued critically against Richard Duncan Jones and others. And here quotes, to my mind, Gilliam's cautious investigation into the value of the literary evidence on the plague is still the most valuable we have. He concluded that 1 to 2% of the population of the empire may have died in the 160s. And I applaud the quantification, and I think it's clarifying. And I think it's completely implausible. Consider that the crude death rate in the Roman Empire in a normal year must have been in the 30s, meaning that 30 out of 1,000 or about 3% of the population died. And I think this really underscores why we need to have demographic models and comparative study of epidemics. So I guess his conclusion is that the Antonine plague, when all of a sudden we have an extraordinary number of sources telling us that more people died than ever, was in fact a year when half or less of the normal number of people who died in the Roman Empire perished. Of course, that's completely implausible. To give us another point of comparison, most early modern demographers who work on Europe where there is good evidence consider crisis mortality to be a year in which mortality is 3 times a baseline average, whether we take that as 5 years or 10 years. So roughly 8 to 10% mortality is a crisis level of mortality. In the Roman case, we don't have the same kind of evidence that the demographers of early modern Europe have. And so we have to use a range of textual and documentary sources. We have to use proxy evidence. And then I'll try and show how we might look to patterns in the census records of Roman Egypt, as well as other papyrological series in Egypt for clues. Starting with the textual and documentary evidence, it's just a fact that we're always going to depend, in the case of ancient pandemics, more than we would like for written evidence, whether it's historians like Ammianus or medical sources like Galen. We're going to be uncomfortably dependent upon them. So we have to use them as well as we can. We have to use them, of course, critically. And using them critically means probing within the sources themselves for how they understand the world and how they perceive the pandemic within the frame and the language that they have. For, I think, a wonderful example of this, Rebecca Fleming published a study on Galen and the Antonine plague that came out after my book. I wish I'd had it. But it's a very, very sensitive and searching analysis that shows for Galen, this was a serious medical event. It was not a complete social meltdown. He sees the world often in terms of Hippocrates and Thucydides. And for Galen, the only reference point that compared to the Antonine plague was the plague described by Thucydides, although Galen is very sensitive to differences with the plague of Thucydides, with the plague of Athens. And for Galen, the Antonine plague was clearly a completely exceptional, unique event in his life. And I think it underscores the uniqueness and significance of the Antonine plague. So we can look critically within sources, but then to me, what's just as compelling is looking at all the sources that exist within a period. And to me, this is really the slam dunk point. And maybe we can talk about this, because I can't wrap my mind around hyperskepticism when within a period you have every single kind of source, whether it's Lucian and sort of comic sources, or whether it's medical sources, whether it's historiography. You have such consistent evidence from such a variety of witnesses that are geographically widespread, who all testify that suddenly there was a dramatic mortality event. So I think we can look at the sources collectively. And then I think it's valuable to look, zoom out even further and to look across periods. And here I reprint the evidence that I was able to find for all known epidemics in the 200 years or so leading up to the Antonine plague. And it's really pretty meager. There's less evidence for pandemic disease or even epidemic disease in the 2 centuries leading down to 165 than there is in the next 5 years. So clearly there's this extraordinary cluster of evidence of all different kinds that happens to survive from the 160s. And so I think that helps us see the spatial and temporal patterns of variability in epidemic mortality. And clearly what happens in the 160s stands out against this broader record for the history of pestilence. And certainly there's a lot that we don't know, and there must have been disease events that are poorly attested. But even so, to me, this is extraordinary testimony to the importance of this event. So we're thrown back on these sort of textual sources. Some of them are contemporary, like Galen. Some of them are actually transmitting sort of chronicle and other historical sources. So Jerome and Ammianus, as important as they are not direct testimony, but nonetheless, there's a high degree of consistency between both the contemporary and the later traditions. One of the things that's very striking about the evidence for the Antonine plague is that it's not just the textual evidence, but also the documentary evidence. And as mentioned, the Romans perceived this event in religious terms, and imagine that the plague has been sent by the god Apollo. And there's a really extraordinary body of epigraphic evidence in the form of oracles that are sent out from the temples of Apollo that tell cities how to try and stop the disease or avoid the disease, from amulets, as well as apotropaic inscriptions that Christopher Jones has studied, and of which there are 12 or now 13 that survive from the later 2nd century. So the Antonine plague provokes this extraordinary body of epigraphic evidence that simply doesn't exist in earlier periods, that I think give us a broader sense of the scope of this event. And then the papyri in general are somewhat disappointing for students of ancient disease, but the Antonine plague actually has more evidence in the papyri than later Roman pandemics. There's a carbonized roll from the Delta, Pepmuis 1, that refers in one village to the pestilential situation. And then there's a later papyrus from the Fayum that records over the course of 2 months, something like 1/3 of adult men dying, although it's an open question whether we should see that specifically as an episode in the history of the Antonine plague, but certainly something drastic happened. But in general, the papyri had been fairly disappointing in terms of yielding direct evidence for the plagues, although, as I said, more for the Antonine than any of the later plagues. If we want to turn to other kinds of evidence, historians have used proxy evidence, whether document series, and this has generally been the approach of Richard Duncan Jones. I think it's intriguing, it's suggestive, if not conclusive, that a number of different kinds of dated series are severely disrupted in the later 160s. Here you see his evidence for army diplomas, and I encourage you to read his 2018 follow-up study that responds to some of the earlier criticisms that Christer Brun and others have made. We have physical proxies, and I know that Andrew Wilson is going to talk later in this series, and I look forward to that. Here you see some of his team's data. It's been reanalyzed in the latest Journal of Roman Archaeology by Richard Saller and team. That clearly shows this is a non-background lead readings in Greenland ice cores, and clearly seems to be some kind of break in the 160s that can be taken as a proxy, at least for probably metal production. Whether that's really indicative of demographic change is of course a separate question, but it's obviously plausible. We can turn to archaeological proxies. Here you see the very recent publication of the Tiber Valley survey from the British school, Robert Witcher's evidence. The yellow line is mine, showing the years of the Antonine plague. If you just look at the blue, these are amphorae from north of Rome. So we're in the Tiber Valley, just to the north of Rome. And I think most people working in Italy would tell you clearly that something happens in the later 2nd century. And certainly there's temporal overlap. So there's major ruptures in systems of settlement and exchange. Again, what causes it is a separate question, but it's the kind of evidence that we can at least draw into the conversation when trying to understand the dimensions and nature of change in the later 2nd century. And it is quite striking that in the Italian archaeology around Rome in the later 2nd century, there's clearly massive change in at least systems of settlement and exchange that we have to reckon with. I found compelling indirect evidence from the papyri of Egypt. Some of the, I shouldn't say all of these are census, petrological patterns in Roman Egypt. Here you see a record of land prices with the Antonine plague marked, and seems to be a structural decrease in the price of land, which of course would be very consistent with a demographic shock. Here you see a series of real rents that I put together, building on the series of Drexhaga and trying to update those and then respond to criticisms that Roger Bagnall had made of Walter Scheidel's use of these data. So I spent a lot of time trying to account for fallowing in the rent contracts. And it does confirm the general picture that around the time of the Antonine plague, real rents decline in Egypt, which again suggests that there is some kind of demographic change, that the supply of labor goes down and the price of labor goes down. I've not published these. I don't know if I will get around to it or not, but certainly small sample sizes, but relatively interesting, and suggests that in the aftermath of the Antonine plague, people started marrying earlier. This is just the evidence for women. It's actually even more stark for men. So women aged 12 to 18 after the plague, far more of them are married, same for 19 to 24-year-olds. We know from early modern Europe that when there is a significant demographic loss, one of the things that happens is that people marry younger in the aftermath to try and ramp back up fertility. Certainly this seems to be happening in Roman Egypt. And then also, I haven't published this, but changes in the social location of slavery. So again, before and after the plague, and before the plague, you can see relatively high levels of households in the cities own slaves. That goes down a little bit after the plague, but the really dramatic change is in the villages where before the Antonine plague, actually very few village households own slaves. And after the plague, quite a significant number of village households have registered slaves. And again, I think this is very consistent with the idea that the supply of labor goes down, the price of labor goes up, the value of labor goes up. And so you have a kind of rebalancing of slavery towards the Egyptian countryside in the aftermath of the plague, because there's more demand for labor, at least. That's one possible story. And the sample sizes here aren't tiny. So that pattern to me looks to be pretty robust. So all of that can support the interpretation of a significant demographic impact. If that's the case, I think that urbanism and trade played into the transmission of the Antonine plague. Since most people lived in the countryside, one of the key questions is, what is the impact of the Antonine plague outside of the cities, and how integrated were rural and urban areas, and how much did that help support the transmission of the plague? One of the really key open questions, I think, is whether or not The rural impacts of the plague were a first order impact, whether peasants just died because they were closely connected to the cities and the virus managed to transmit into the countryside, or whether we're looking at second order effects, that is that places like Rome were hard hit, and so all of a sudden there weren't markets for peasants to sell their goods. So still lots of open questions, and that's before even turning to the bigger socio-political impacts. And I'll just end here. When we think about where the Antonine plague sits in the bigger picture of Roman history, we're obviously asking a question that must involve a much broader range of factors. And the transformations of the Roman world in the later 2nd century can involve climate, geopolitics, new enemies across the frontier, and changes in the systems of state and society. But I would argue that even if we do bring those other factors into the conversation, we still need biological causes to have a complete understanding of the changes that unfold in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. And that the real question is simply the relative weight that we assign to biological causes like infectious disease. And to me, however bad an Emperor Commodus was, and however formidable the Marcomanni may have been, they're very compelling signs for true demographic change, changes in the price of land relative to labor, changes in the location of slaves. And that, I think, is very consistent with a strong element of biological causation in the transformations of the Roman world. And we can imagine these in terms of shock and conjuncture. To me, the Antonine plague is ultimately caused by the arrival and evolution of a new virus. It wasn't caused by changes that were inevitable inside Roman state and society. It came from without, both geographically, but also from without, from the outside of the Roman system of state and society. But at the same time, its effects were felt within. And it's the conjuncture of long-term trends in Roman state and society with these kinds of sudden shocks that I think are how we can understand the history of plagues in antiquity. And twist my arm, all of this evidence to me seems consistent with a significant but not overwhelmingly catastrophic effect in the rural sphere. I think there's so much that we don't know about the penetration of the Antonine plague into the countryside, particularly outside of Egypt, that makes it very hazardous to guess whether this is really a crisis level mortality. I think that the literary evidence is very compelling for very significant levels of urban mortality. Wouldn't be impossible to think of it in terms of a 5 to 10-fold increase over the baseline. And if that's the case, then the Antonine plague could have caused both a shock to the labor supply, so a decrease in the number of farmers and aggregate output, as well as shocks to the demand side, with urban markets decreasing in ways that have complex effects on rural producers. There are also signs that I haven't gone into here that this has ramifications for Roman army recruitment and more broadly fiscal socio-political dimensions. But that's for another day. I appreciate your attention and hope that we can have a vigorous discussion about what we know and what we would like to know about this important disease event in the past. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kyle, very much. If we were in a normal lecture hall setting, I'm sure you would hear the thunderous applause from 500 people appreciative of your discussion here. So thank you very much. A lot of really fascinating and obviously extremely relevant for our own day thoughts and topics raised in there. And we've had already a fair number of questions coming in through the Q&A. I imagine that there are going to be a few more in the next few minutes as people think about what you've said. So I wondered if I could start and ask to go back to both what you started with and hear where you wound up about the relationship between these endogenous and exogenous factors, and particularly where you think within that we might balance what you might call natural and what you might call anthropogenic factors within the broader world. Is Alain Bresson's comment in the JRA review fair to say this is the thunderous entry of nature Or would you say the relationship is maybe more complex than that?
Right. Well, it's hard always not to say it's more complex, but let me start by addressing the way you frame the question, because the framing will have so much influence over the way we answer the question. And on the one hand, I started by framing it in terms of, should we imagine it as endogenous or exogenous? And those are weighty terms that that usually we employ in the sense that economists would. And by endogenous, we really need to specify, do we just mean Malthusian? Because I think that's a very credible hypothesis that the Roman Empire just grew too fast. The population expands too fast. And again, there's a lot of good comparative evidence for pre-industrial societies that population growth can sort of generate these negative feedbacks endogenously, that population growth can outstrip productivity growth, particularly as there's more people, they're moved onto more and more marginal land. And so if Italian population was really, at the levels that Elio Lacascia thinks, then probably people would have been getting pretty hungry. And when people get to that level of starvation, then they're going to die of something. And so in a really strictly Malthusian endogenous model, it almost doesn't matter what infectious disease it is. People are just dying because they're starving. And since it's pre-modern times, it's going to be some infectious disease or other. But the actual causal mechanisms that we need to understand it are limited to kind of population and the relation between population and agricultural output. So I don't think while I think that's a very credible theory, and I'm kind of always haunted by it because I do think it's sort of the other hypothesis that's really compelling. I don't think that it necessarily it is compelling. And for instance, that one way we can see this is real wages in Egypt. And again, I've worked on that data series and tried to really nail down the data over time. And if the population were growing so fast that biological well-being was going down, we would expect real wages to be declining. And it doesn't seem from the admittedly highly imperfect evidence from Egypt that you have a kind of decline in real wages due to population growth. But that's just Egypt. And if you came back and said, look, having worked in central Italy, there's too many people there. I think we could potentially accommodate that. I do still sort of wonder if maybe parts of the empire weren't sort of teetering on a kind of Malthusian cliff, and that the evidence from Egypt is just from one province that isn't representative. But that obviously involves bigger questions about population and economic growth. And I know Andrew Wilson's going to speak later and probably will bring up some of these issues as well. But on the whole, I don't think that we should envision the Antonine plague as sort of coming from directly from Malthusian causes. Although, we don't also have to see that as a strict either or. I do think you can imagine that maybe this is a pre-industrial society. Most people are very, very poor. And you'd had enough population growth over the second century that some of these populations may have been kind of already biologically susceptible to infection. But the other reason why I don't think that's compelling is that clearly there's this evolutionary event. This isn't an endogenous disease, or an endemic disease that just sort of gets out of hand. This clearly geographically seems to come from without. It sweeps over the empire. It's totally out of proportion to anything that had been coming. I don't think people are, I don't think that there's a really good case for climate being the trigger. Again, I'd be very open-minded to that, but the better volcanic eruption chronologies seem to suggest that there's an eruption, pretty big eruption just after the Antonine plague outbreaks. It could have made things worse if you have crop failure And maybe some of the secondary outbreaks really do happen in the midst of a kind of emerging climate challenge. But I just don't think that there's very good way, either through social and economic mechanisms or through climate mechanisms, to explain why you all of a sudden have this, what seems to me, explosion of evidence for an infectious disease outbreak. So I think the best explanation for its causes are biological, but its effects, of course, are a different question, and go back to how we frame it. You know, I don't think that we need to ever see the effects of a disease like this just happening on their own. It then involves where is the population and the economy, and other dimensions. But anyway, that's kind of a long answer already.
Well, it's a very detailed and very obviously well thought out answer that just highlights the immense complexity of that kind of question. And since you brought climate into it as well, I mean, add that separate dimension and all of the vagaries of some of those proxy data, then it gets immeasurably more complex. We have now accumulated quite a few questions from attendees. So let's just, maybe we can start with some of those. So on the nature of the preservation of evidence, and particularly coming back to Egypt repeatedly, John Bodell asks whether the papyrological evidence for the Antonine plague is maybe less than anticipated because of the peculiar environmental conditions and general lack of urbanization in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, this, I'll be honest, this is one of the things that really bothers me, because I don't have a great answer. And yet it actually bothers me even more for the Justinianic plague, because in the middle of the 6th century, there's, Marcel Keller will talk about this in a few weeks, but there's clearly a significant disease outbreak. We now know its biological cause, it's Yersinia pestis. And we can debate the demographic impact. I tend to think it was pretty significant, and it's just not in the papyri. You can see its effects if you want, and tax rates go up and so on. And the same of the plague of Cyprian in the middle of the 3rd century, which is another pretty big disease outbreak. And then the Antonine plague, I'm saying it's better because at least there's sort of like 2 papyri that you can point to. One at least does say there's a pestilential situation, and yet I think we have to ask ourselves, what would we expect? This is a world where most people, most of the time, die of infectious causes. So even in a healthy year, where say 3% of the population dies, probably, if we're only have comparative evidence, but probably half to 2/3 of those people die of infectious causes, right? So most people aren't living and dying of getting Alzheimer's, right? You're dead long before that. And the papyri just aren't a very good source for the history of health and disease, period. Even so, you would think if you have these really, really bad years that it would leave traces, people would write letters about it. But I just think it ultimately is about the kind of documents we have and the kinds of things people observe, mean that plagues don't show up well in the papyri. I still find that uncomfortable, and I wish there were more evidence. I think it'd be more compelling if there were, but just the reality is that the kinds of documents we have and the kinds of societies these are and the kinds of things people observe mean that what survives on papyri are transactions and government records and contracts and accounts. And it's very, very hard to see epidemic mortality through the papyri.
Right, thank you. So maybe to build on some of the points that you just made there, particularly about the normal crude death rate. Sean McKinnon from the University of Alberta asks that given this crude death rate that you've discussed, is it possible that the Antonine plague has an overestimated death rate because of elite bias in our sources, and I guess potentially also in the kinds of accounting records that you see in Egypt. The plague may be so strongly represented in our sources because it brought similar crude mortality rates to the empire to a subpopulation, that of the elites, that wasn't used to it.
Yeah, I mean, great question. And there's lots that can be said about that. I'll start with just underscoring, we don't know what the crude death rate was in the Roman Empire. We just know sort of the parameters of what's possible. We know that the Roman Empire wasn't a post-transitional society with low crude death rates. So in the modern world, you might get, leaving COVID aside, you might get a crude death rate of 8, 9, 10 a year, and out of 1,000. And in these kind of pre-transitional societies, it was more like, high 20s to high 30s, and depended on the year, and then depended on geography. Mediterranean societies are generally less healthy than Northern European societies, almost entirely due to malaria. So we don't really know what the Roman Empire was. We just know that it probably had to be somewhere in the 30 to 35-ish range. And the question raises interesting points about differential mortality within societies. And it's a very open question whether pre-modern societies had health inequities that mapped on to social inequities. And I think in general, they didn't. And in fact, one of the really important transitions in the kind of road to modernity is the development of very consistent health inequities that mirror social inequities. And down to about 1700, so down to about 300 years ago, if you were elite economically or in social status, your life expectancies generally weren't longer than the average person. And they might have been longer than the truly poor people. If you're a Malthusian, you kind of have to believe that mortality operates by really affecting the poorest. But they probably didn't help you to be a king or an aristocrat. And there have been very good studies on this on the early modern period, going back to Hollingsworth's studies of the British peerage, and even in recent years, some very good papers on this. And then Walters Scheitel's done some of the same kind of work on ancient aristocrats and emperors. And so I would be skeptical that the Roman elite enjoyed substantially better lifespans or life expectancies than ordinary people. Infectious disease is not a real respecter of persons. It doesn't really have hugely different effects on the rich and the poor, with important exceptions. But just think about Marcus Aurelius and Faustina. You're talking about the richest people in the world, literally, and they have 14. Faustina has 14 kids, and we only know of 2 of them that certainly survived their parents. So even in normal times, the Roman aristocracy, the Greek educated elites who write about death, they're used to very high levels of background mortality. So I don't think that the best way to explain this, the kind of evidence we have, is that the social class of the observers wasn't used to infectious disease mortality. I think they were. But I'll conclude by saying something in support of what I think is the thrust of the question, that one of the reasons why these epidemic and pandemic events may have been important is the age structure of mortality, because you would have had a disproportionate number, not so much of rich people, but of adults dying. And when you're losing 3% of the population a year, but a third of those are probably infants, that's one thing. When you're losing 5-10% of the population, and most of them are adults, it has much more serious social and economic impacts, military impacts, and so on.
Great, thank you. Maybe we can move to talking about some of the impacts and the ways that people responded. There are a series of questions talking about asking about how the Romans responded to the arrival of this disease. So Daniel Lawrence asks, related to the London lead plate as a preventative, what other preventative measures would ancient Romans have used to try to combat the Antonine plague, even if done in vain? Were there any centralized public health initiatives or mandates from the Roman Empire relating to this disease, extant speeches, public addresses, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's another great question and a very hard one, and also one where I think the answer is largely negative. In that, let's very quickly bracket off the religious response, because I do think that's the big response. Is the Romans think that the god Apollo is angry, and maybe it's largely due to the kinds of sources that we have, but that survive on stone and so on. But clearly, the major public response to this is to say, how can we appease the god Apollo? And you see that both at the public and the private level. So like these amulets are clearly kind of in the private sphere. People are trying to protect themselves. They put up these apotropaic inscriptions that probably are promoted by an oracle of Apollo, as Christopher has argued. And then you also have public responses. So these, is it 7 or 8 inscriptions that survive that are a reflection of public decisions to send an embassy. So they send, the city of Hierapolis sends an ambassador to Claros to go ask the god, what do we do? And they get these responses back. And it's usually sacrifice, put up a statue of the god, or one of them says fumigate, which is very interesting, and a quasi-religious, quasi-public health to kind of burn out the miasma, to use smoke. And this is attested as early as Hippocrates. And whether that's religious or scientific, it crosses those boundaries that we may impose on them. But okay, so set that aside, these kind of efforts to appease the gods, and particularly Apollo, which I think is about 99% of what goes on. We don't see what I would consider a public health response. One of the instructions that the god Apollo gives seems to be not to kiss. If again, Christopher's reconstruction of a word that's fragmentary is correct, then the god told people stop kissing, which in ancient Mediterranean society was a common form of social greeting, and in the midst of a smallpox pandemic is a very bad idea. For that matter, in the midst of COVID is a bad idea. Don't go around kissing strangers. So, there's again a piece of health advice that's interesting and seems to betray some kind of recognition of the communicability of the disease, the idea that it's contagious. But what we don't really see anywhere in the 2nd century are what we would, in our modern terms, consider a public health response. Is there quarantine? No. No evidence of quarantine until the Justinianic pandemic. Is there isolation? No. And the truth is that the respiratory viruses are very hard to deal with. So if it is smallpox, which is a respiratory virus, these are some of the most beguiling kinds of pathogenic agents, as we're finding out. If you have big science, you have vaccines, but that's a long way in the future. If you don't have vaccines, it's very tricky to control. And so there's really very little that they could have done. But even beyond that, they didn't have public health officials. Most of what we would consider ancient public health had to do with kind of urban cleanliness, with keeping streets clean, with disposing of waste, with fresh water supplies, and not things that really get into anything that would help control a respiratory virus.
Right. I'm keeping an eye on our ticking down minutes here, and so we're moving towards the end of our time here together. So I want to ask. Let's see. Let me find it again. Sorry, scrolling through here. So a question from there are a lot of questions here that deal with putting the Roman situation, the Antonine plague situation, into a broader context of historical epidemiology. And I'm sure that a lot of these things you'll be addressing in your new book, right? So I apologize to all of the attendees who are asking things we're not going to get to, but certainly all the questions will get to Kyle, and he'll be able to think about them later. Perhaps, though, we can end with a final question that ties this back into thinking about how we experience these things today and what we might do for future investigations of our own time. And a student from my class asks, Jordan Chiron, seeing as no account of past plagues has been complete, it seems foolish to think that our current records of COVID-19 will prove sufficient for future scholars. What do you think we can do better than we're currently doing to preserve necessary knowledge? And what do you think may be problematic in contemporary sources?
Yeah, I mean, these are the great questions, kind of questions I think anybody who's working on the history of disease has been thinking about. And I mean, you just look at our world where we have such amazing science and understanding of the virology to the epidemiology. We have such strong states, strong governments, and huge bureaucracies and health apparatus. And we still argue about how many people actually die of COVID. I mean, some of it's politically stupid, but some of it's really is serious questions of surveillance and accounting. I mean, you go back, and that's sort of in the light of day with all the tools and knowledge that we have, and we still have so many profound questions about the impact of the disease. And then think even more conceptually about the kind of role of what I call shock and conjuncture. Think about all the things that are going on politically in 2020, right? From the kind of galvanizing energy behind efforts at addressing America's race problems to the kind of political discontent and the possibility of a kind of terrifying constitutional crisis. COVID didn't cause any of that, right? I mean, America's race problems, Donald Trump, constitutional issues, the disease didn't cause any of that. But yet, in some ways, clearly the two have become sort of entangled, right? I mean, you couldn't separate COVID from the electoral politics or from the kind of social energy that's been galvanized. There clearly is some kind of connection that's still very hard to understand, right? I mean, even again, living through it in the light of day, it's very hard to understand all of the ways in which it's all connected. And I think it'll be really interesting after we have a little bit of space behind us to kind of go back and try and sort out counterfactually how would the course of events, how could it have been different if there hadn't been a medical crisis in the midst of all these other kind of longer term trends. And so I think it's good to think with. It can be stimulating, and it certainly, I think, probably helps us think about the past in bigger ways than we might otherwise would have. And I think the kind of psychological experience of living through a pandemic has really been eye-opening and helps you read the ancient sources differently and maybe more empathetically. And to think about the psychological toll of these events, right? I mean, the COVID, beyond just the number of people who've got sick and the level of mortality, the kind of collective psychological trauma and difficulty of the whole experience and the way that manifests in political and social unrest and change. It's fascinating to live through. I think it'll help us be better historians, I hope, and certainly will give us new ways to explore these past events.
Well, thank you very much for that very thoughtful conclusion to this discussion. There's so much more we could say. I want to thank all of our attendees for submitting so many great and thoughtful questions. Like I said, if we didn't get to anything live here, we'll certainly pass them on to Kyle for further consideration. We're almost at the end of our time here, so let me finish by saying thank you very much again, Kyle, for your time.
Thank you.
For such a stimulating talk. We'll all really look forward to the next book. And thank you everybody else for tuning in to attend. I hope that you'll join us again next Thursday for Andrew Wilson's talk on the economic impacts of the Antonine Plague, where we'll continue to build on a lot of what Kyle has said here, I'm sure. So thank everybody. Thank you all very much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.